Keith Whitley was found dead in his Goodlettsville home just after noon today. At this point, his death is a mystery to police. Barb Kramer reports.
The story of Keith Whitley is one of country music's most heartbreaking tragedies, wrapped in mystery, unanswered questions, and a legacy that still echoes through Nashville. On the surface, Whitley was a star on the rise, a singer with a voice that could bring both joy and tears, a man whose raw honesty and emotional depth resonated deeply with fans. Yet behind the bright lights and chart-topping hits lay a darkness he struggled to escape. When Keith Whitley was found dead at just 34 years old, the world was stunned. The official cause of death, alcohol poisoning, seemed straightforward, but for many it didn't tell the full story. Friends, family, and fans were left wondering, was there more to it? Was his downfall simply the result of addiction? Or were there deeper forces, secrets, and struggles that the world never fully understood? For decades, whispers surrounded Whitley's passing. Some believed it was a slow unraveling brought on by years of inner demons, while others suspected that the pressures of fame and the relentless expectations of the industry played a far greater role than anyone admitted. The more people looked into his final days, the more the mystery deepened. Now, years later, as stories from those closest to him resurface and long-guarded truths come to light, a darker picture emerges. The real story of Keith Whitley's tragic end is far more complicated and far more devastating than the headlines suggested. And as we peel back the layers of his short but unforgettable life, we uncover not just the brilliance of his music, but the painful mystery that consumed him until the very end. Long before tragedy cast a shadow over Keith Whitley's name, he was a boy from Sandy Hook, Kentucky, whose voice carried the soul of the Appalachian Hills. Born on July 1, 1954, Jackie Keith Whitley grew up in a modest household, surrounded by the traditions of bluegrass and mountain music. From the beginning, there was something extraordinary about him. His singing wasn't polished or artificial, it was natural, pure, and filled with emotion beyond his years. By the time he was in his teens, Whitley was already carving a place for himself in local music circles. Alongside his friend Ricky Skaggs, he began playing at regional festivals, impressing audiences with both his musicianship and his hauntingly mature voice. At just 15, Whitley was invited to perform with Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys, a remarkable feat for someone so young. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a calling. Ralph Stanley later remarked that Whitley was one of the finest singers he had ever heard, even at such a tender age. But what set Keith apart wasn't just technical skill, it was his ability to channel raw feeling. Whether he was singing bluegrass standards or experimenting with traditional country ballads, he carried a weight in his delivery that hinted at an old soul. His voice conveyed heartbreak, longing, and vulnerability in ways that seemed almost prophetic, as though he was destined to live out the very pain he sang about. The 1970s saw Whitley deepen his involvement in the music world. His time with J.D. Crowe and the New South, one of the most influential bluegrass groups of its era, helped him refine his artistry. Surrounded by musicians of extraordinary talent, Keith began to develop a style that blended the heart of bluegrass with the accessibility of mainstream country. It was during this period that industry insiders began whispering that Whitley could be the future of country music. By the early 1980s, he was ready to step fully into the spotlight. Signed to RCA Records in Nashville, Whitley began shaping the sound that would define his too-brief career. His debut solo work, including the album A Hard Act to Follow in 1984, hinted at his potential, though it wasn't until his later releases that his artistry truly exploded onto the national stage. With songs like Miami, My Amy, and 10 Feet Away, Keith's voice began to resonate with a wider audience. Fans and critics alike saw in him the torchbearer of traditional country during a time when the genre was shifting toward a more polished, pop-infused sound. Yet, even as success arrived, Keith carried with him an undercurrent of struggle. Friends from his early years often recalled how Keith was drawn to alcohol from a young age. Some believed it was tied to the pressures of performing, while others thought it was his way of quieting the storms within. The The same sensitivity that made him such a powerful singer also made him deeply vulnerable. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that Keith Whitley was destined for greatness. His star was rising fast, and Nashville saw in him a figure who could rival legends. But beneath the growing fame, the seeds of tragedy had already been planted. His voice carried the pain of a man who lived on the edge, and as the world would soon discover, that edge was far closer than anyone realized. The boy from Kentucky had turned into a country star, but the battles he fought off stage were only beginning to reveal themselves. By the mid-1980s, Keith Whitley was no longer just a promising voice from Kentucky. He was becoming one of Nashville's brightest stars. His blend of traditional country sincerity and modern accessibility made him stand out in a crowded industry. When his 1985 single Miami, My Amy climbed the charts, it announced to the world that Whitley had arrived. Audiences fell in love with the voice that could break hearts in just a few verses, and critics hailed him as the future of country music. But behind every great artist's rise, there is often a personal story, and for Keith, that story was filled with both love and turbulence. His most defining personal relationship was with fellow country star Lorrie Morgan. When Keith and Lorrie's paths crossed, it felt like destiny. Their connection was immediate, and their love story became one of the most talked-about romances in Nashville. Fans saw them as country music's golden couple, two talents whose voices and hearts were intertwined. Their marriage in 1986 brought stability to Keith's whirlwind life, at least for a while. Lorrie often spoke about how deeply she loved Keith and how she saw in him not just a superstar, but a vulnerable man struggling to balance his extraordinary talent with his personal demons. For Keith, Lorrie represented a safe harbor, a partner who understood the pressures of fame, the late nights, and the sacrifices that came with being in the public eye. Together, they welcomed a son, Jesse Keith Whitley, adding yet another layer of hope to Keith's story. Professionally, Keith was soaring. In 1988, his album Don't Close Your Eyes became a monumental success. The title track, along with When You Say Nothing at All and I'm No Stranger to the Rain, cemented his reputation as a masterful storyteller through song. These hits weren't just popular. They became timeless classics that defined an era of country music. The emotional honesty in his delivery connected with audiences in a way few artists could replicate. Whitley wasn't just singing. He was living every word, pouring his soul into the music. But even as his career reached new heights, Keith's old battle with alcohol persisted. Friends and colleagues recalled how he often drank heavily, sometimes before performances, sometimes after, and sometimes both. Lorrie Morgan tried to support him, encouraging him to seek help and reminding him of the family they were building. Keith did make attempts at sobriety, but the cycle was difficult to break. Alcohol was more than a habit. It was a refuge, a way of dulling the pressures and insecurities that fame had magnified. What made it more heartbreaking was that Keith was fully aware of his struggle. He spoke openly with those closest to him about his desire to get better, his fear of losing everything, and his guilt over how his drinking affected his loved ones. Yet, like many who battle addiction, he was caught in a devastating push and pull, wanting to stop, yet unable to free himself from the grip of the bottle. As his marriage to Lorrie deepened, so too did the challenges they faced together. Lorrie later admitted that she lived in constant worry, fearing the phone might ring with news that Keith had gone too far. Despite the love, the success, and the family they shared, there was always a shadow looming over their happiness. By 1989, Keith Whitley was on the verge of becoming one of country music's greatest stars with the world at his feet. Yet, behind closed doors, the storm within him was growing stronger. His voice could silence a room and bring tears to an audience, but the man himself was still searching for peace. Tragically, time was running out, and the pressures he carried were leading him toward a fate no one could have imagined. By the spring of 1989, Keith Whitley was standing on the edge of greatness. His album Don't Close Your Eyes had produced back-to-back hits, and Nashville insiders were calling him the next great torchbearer of traditional country music. To many, it seemed that Keith was finally on the brink of achieving the kind of stardom that legends are made of. But behind the glow of success, his private struggles were worsening, and those closest to him could sense the danger building. Friends and colleagues later recalled that Keith's drinking had become both unpredictable and alarming. Some nights he was fine, in control, and determined to stay sober. On others, he slipped back into the old patterns with devastating force. Lori Morgan, who loved him deeply, lived in constant fear that his addiction would consume him. She described sleepless nights, waiting and worrying, never fully knowing what state Keith would be in when he walked through the door, or if he would walk through it at all. In early May of that year, Keith seemed to be doing better. He was optimistic about new music, excited about upcoming projects, and still very much committed to being a father and husband. Those who spoke with him said he sounded upbeat, even hopeful. But addiction is a storm that rarely moves in a straight line. What looked like stability could quickly turn into disaster. On May 9, 1989, tragedy struck. Keith Whitley was found unresponsive at his home in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. The news sent shockwaves through the country music world. At just 34 years old, one of its brightest stars was gone. The official cause of death was acute alcohol poisoning. Reports indicated that Keith's blood alcohol level was 47, nearly 5 times the legal limit. It was a staggering number, one that underscored just how powerful his addiction had become. Yet even with an official explanation, questions lingered. How could someone with so much promise, so much to live for, allow himself to slip away so suddenly? Was it truly just alcohol, or was there more to the story? Friends whispered about the unbearable pressures Keith faced, both from his own expectations and from an industry that demanded perfection. Others suggested that Keith's sensitive nature, the same quality that made him such an extraordinary artist, also left him vulnerable to despair. In the days following his death, tributes poured in. Fellow musicians mourned not just the loss of a friend, but of an artist whose potential had only begun to be realized. Randy Travis, Alan Jackson, and other rising stars pointed to Keith as an influence, a man who had reminded country music of its roots at a time when it was drifting toward pop sounds. Fans gathered outside his home, leaving flowers, notes, and tears for a man whose voice had touched their lives so deeply. But for Lori Morgan, the tragedy was personal and crushing. She had lost not just a husband, but her partner, her confidant, and the father of her child. In later years, she admitted that she replayed those final days over and over in her mind, wondering if she could have done more, wondering why love wasn't enough to save him. The mystery of Keith Whitley's death isn't just about how he died, but why. Why a man with such talent, love, and opportunity couldn't escape the demons that haunted him. Why someone who gave the world so much music couldn't find the peace he so desperately needed. His final days remain a heartbreaking reminder of how fragile even the brightest lights can be. Keith Whitley's untimely passing left behind not only a grieving family and fan base, but also a mystery that haunted country music for decades. For years, the official story remained simple. He drank too much, too fast, and it caught up with him. But in reality, the truth was far more layered, and perhaps more tragic than anyone wanted to admit. Behind the music, behind the charming voice that could sing heartbreak like no other, Keith was fighting a war with himself. Friends and colleagues admitted that his talent was unmatched, yet his demons were relentless. Even after attempts at sobriety, relapse was always around the corner. Many believed the industry's pressure only magnified the struggle. The touring, the recording deadlines, the expectations of carrying on the tradition of greats like George Jones, all of it weighed on him in ways fans rarely saw. What makes the mystery so unsettling is not just how Keith died, but what was lost because of it. Doctors who examined the details later revealed that his body showed signs of years of stress and damage from alcohol use. It wasn't simply a tragic accident. It was the result of a long and painful decline that had been ignored, brushed aside, or hidden. His closest friends now admit that there were warning signs. He had told people he couldn't stop, even when he wanted to. But in a culture where drinking was often celebrated in the music and in the lifestyle, Keith's struggles were almost normalized until it was too late. The tragedy deepens when looking at the impact on his family. Lori Morgan, his wife at the time, was left with overwhelming grief. She had tried to support him, to save him, but the disease was stronger than her love. In interviews, she has spoken with raw honesty about the pain of losing him and the weight of living with the questions that followed. Could more have been done? Could someone have stopped it? These questions have lingered in the minds of those closest to Keith, even decades later. For fans, Keith Whitley remains a haunting reminder of brilliance cut short. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All still carry a bittersweet resonance. They aren't just country hits. They're the echoes of a man who poured his entire heart into every note, even as his own life was unraveling behind the scenes. When people listen now, it's impossible not to wonder what more he could have given if he had lived longer. The final revelation about his passing, that it wasn't just one night of bad decisions, but the culmination of years of battles he couldn't win, has left fans with a deeper sadness. It reframes his story from a shocking accident to an unavoidable tragedy, and that's what makes the mystery so devastating. It isn't just about how Keith Whitley died, it's about the fact that he never truly got the chance to live free from the grip of addiction. Today, his story serves as a lesson, both in the music world and beyond. It reminds us that even those who seem larger than life, who bring joy and beauty to millions, can be suffering in silence. It also challenges the culture around fame, asking how many more brilliant voices will be silenced before change truly happens. Keith's life may have ended in heartbreak, but his music ensures he will never be forgotten. And now that the full truth is out, it casts his songs in a different light, not just as performances, but as cries from a man who lived every word he sang. That's why the Keith Whitley mystery, though finally solved, is one of the saddest chapters in country music history.